My wife skipped my mother's funeral because her dog had a stomachache. My mother died on a Tuesday after 8 months of cancer. She fought until the end, and her last words were telling me she was proud of the man I'd become. The funeral was scheduled for Saturday. I called my wife Gina at work to let her know, and the first thing she asked was whether it would interfere with her hair appointment. I thought she was joking. She wasn't. She rescheduled but complained about the cancellation fee for 3 days. My mother and Gina never got along. Mom thought Gina was selfish. Gina thought my mother was too involved in our lives. They tolerated each other at holidays, but tension always lingered beneath the surface. Still, this was my mother's funeral. I expected basic decency. The morning of the service, I was putting on my suit when Gina came in and said she couldn't come. Her Pomeranian, a dog named Duchess that she treated better than most people treat their children, had thrown up twice that morning. She said Duchess might have eaten something bad and needed monitoring. I asked if she was serious. She said Duchess could be seriously ill, and she wasn't going to abandon her baby during a medical emergency. I pointed out that dogs throw up all the time, and the dog seemed fine. She said I clearly didn't understand the bond between a pet parent and their fur baby, and my insensitivity was exactly why she didn't want to come anyway. I buried my mother alone. My whole family was there. Aunts, uncles, cousins, friends who'd known my mother for 40 years. Everyone asked where Gina was. I had to explain repeatedly that she was home with a sick dog. The looks on their faces told me everything I needed to know. My aunt pulled me aside and said she'd never liked Gina, but stayed quiet because she wanted me to be happy. Now she couldn't keep quiet. She said any woman who'd skip her mother-in-law's funeral for a dog with an upset stomach wasn't worth staying married to. I defended Gina out of habit, but the words felt empty. When I got home that night, Gina was on the couch watching TV with Duchess curled up perfectly healthy on her lap. She asked how it went like I'd just returned from running errands. I said it was my mother's funeral. How did she think it went? She told me not to be snippy, that she'd had a stressful day too watching Duchess. The dog was fine. Completely fine. Running around, eating treats, begging for belly rubs. No sign of any real illness. Gina had skipped my mother's funeral for absolutely nothing. Something shifted in me that night. I started sleeping in the guest room and told her I needed space to grieve. She complained I was being distant and making her feel neglected. Didn't ask how I was holding up. Didn't offer to talk about my mom or look through old photos with me. Just made my grief about her own feelings of being ignored. Over the next 3 months, I quietly started untangling our lives. Opened my own bank account. Consulted with a divorce lawyer. Started figuring out what was mine and what was ours. Gina noticed nothing. She was too wrapped up in Duchess, her friends, her yoga classes, her weekend brunches. She'd check in occasionally to make sure I was still available for things she needed. Fixing the leaky faucet, attending her coworker's birthday party so she wouldn't show up alone, picking up her dry cleaning when she was running late. I did it all while quietly planning my way out. Then her father had a heart attack. He survived but needed bypass surgery and would be hospitalized for weeks. Gina was hysterical. Her dad was the only person in her family she actually cared about. She came to me sobbing, said she needed to fly to Ohio immediately, said she couldn't handle this alone, said she needed me with her. She asked me to come. I said no. She looked at me like I'd slapped her. Asked what I meant no. I told her I had things going on and couldn't just drop everything. She said this was her father. This was life or death. How could I possibly say no? I brought up my mother's funeral. Duchess and her stomachache. How she'd let me bury my mom by myself because the dog threw up a couple of times. She said that was completely different. I asked her to explain how. She couldn't. Just kept repeating that it was different. That her father could die. That she needed support. I suggested she take Duchess for comfort since clearly the dog was her priority in emergencies. I didn't yell. Didn't throw things. Just said it calmly, which seemed to make it worse for her. She flew to Ohio alone. Her father's surgery went fine. He recovered well. But during those 2 weeks she was gone, I packed up my belongings and moved out. Left her a note saying I'd filed for divorce and my lawyer would contact hers. When she got back and found the house half empty, she called me 25 times in one afternoon. The voicemail swung between sobbing and screaming. I screened the 26th call and let it go to voicemail like all the others. My phone sits on the kitchen counter of this new apartment, buzzing and lighting up every few minutes with another message. I pick it up and listen to the latest one. Gina's voice starts out shaky and apologetic, saying she's sorry, and she didn't mean for things to get this bad. Then halfway through the message, something shifts and suddenly she's yelling about how I abandoned her when her dad almost died, how I'm cruel and heartless, how everyone agrees I'm the bad guy here. The message ends with her crying again. I delete it and see 3 new texts from numbers I don't recognize. They're all from her friends telling me I'm a terrible person. One says I should be ashamed of myself. Another calls me selfish. A third one, from someone I met exactly once at a dinner party 2 years ago, says Gina deserves better than someone who'd leave her during a family emergency. My phone buzzes again with a text from her mom, then another from someone at her office. They all say basically the same thing. I'm the villain in whatever story Gina's been telling. I turn the phone completely off and set it face down on the counter. The apartment is quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. Boxes are stacked against the walls, most of them still taped shut. I've been here 3 days and haven't unpacked anything except what I absolutely needed. A few dishes, some clothes, the coffee maker. Everything else can wait. I sit on the couch, which is the only furniture I brought besides my bed, and stare at the blank wall across from me. Part of me feels guilty for not answering her calls. Part of me wonders if I really am as bad as everyone says. But then I remember standing at my mother's funeral, explaining over and over that my wife was home with a sick dog, and the guilt fades. I made the right choice. I'm sure of it. The next morning, my work phone rings during lunch. I almost don't answer because I figure it's another one of Gina's people calling to tell me off. But the caller ID shows my Uncle Frederick's name. I pick up and he asks how I'm doing. I tell him I'm fine, which isn't exactly true but seems easier than explaining everything. He says he's been thinking about me and wanted to check in. We talk for a few minutes about nothing important, just normal conversation about work and the weather, and then he brings up the funeral. He says he wanted to say something that day when I kept explaining where Gina was. He could see it on my face, he says, every time someone asked and I had to repeat that she was home with a sick dog. He wanted to pull me aside and tell me I deserved better, but he didn't because he thought I loved her and didn't want to make things harder. Now that I've left, he's glad. He says everyone in the family saw what kind of person she was for years. They all thought she was selfish and treated me like I existed just to do things for her. He stayed quiet because he wanted me to be happy, but he's relieved I finally saw it too. I don't know what to say to that. It feels good to hear someone tell me I'm not crazy for leaving. But it also makes me sad that my marriage was apparently so obviously bad that everyone around me could see it except me. I thank him for calling and we hang up. The validation helps. For the first time since I moved out, I feel like maybe I'm not the terrible person Gina and her friends think I am. 3 days later, I'm sitting in Leanna Gomez's office downtown. She's the divorce lawyer I contacted back when I was still sleeping in the guest room, back when I was just starting to plan my way out. Her office is small but organized, with file cabinets lining one wall and family photos on her desk. She pulls out the folder I started months ago and spreads the papers across her desk. Bank statements showing the separate account I opened. A list of everything we own together and what belongs to who. Records of our finances going back 3 years. She looks impressed. She says most people who come to her are a mess, with no preparation and no documentation, but I've done half her job already. I tell her I had time to think about it. She nods and starts explaining how divorce works in Ohio. It's a no-fault state, she says, which means we don't have to prove anyone did anything wrong. We just have to show the marriage is broken beyond repair, which shouldn't be hard. She asks if I think Gina will fight it. I tell her probably, at least at first, because Gina doesn't like not getting her way. Leanna says that's normal and she can handle it. If everything goes smoothly and Gina cooperates, we can have this done in about 6 months. If Gina makes it difficult, it might take longer. She'll send the initial paperwork to Gina's address and we'll go from there. I sign some documents and write her a check for the retainer. Walking out of her office, I feel like I just made everything real in a way it wasn't before. That night, Gina's mother calls me. I specifically told Leanna to request no contact, but apparently that doesn't stop family from trying. I consider not answering, but I figure she'll just keep calling until I do. I pick up and she immediately starts talking. She says Gina is devastated and confused. She doesn't understand what she did wrong. She loves me and wants to fix things. Her mother talks for 40 minutes straight about how Gina is suffering, how this divorce is breaking her heart, how I need to give her another chance. I barely say anything, just listen to her go on and on. Finally, I interrupt and ask her a question. Would she have skipped her own mother-in-law's funeral because her dog had an upset stomach? There's a long silence on the other end. I can hear her breathing, but she doesn't say anything. I wait. Eventually she speaks, her voice quieter now. She says Gina has always been a bit selfish, she knows that, but marriage is about forgiveness. I tell her forgiveness requires the person to admit they did something wrong. Gina still thinks she was justified in staying home with the dog. Gina still thinks my mother's funeral wasn't as important as watching a perfectly healthy animal. Until she understands why that was hurtful, there's nothing to forgive. Her mother doesn't have an answer for that. We hang up a few minutes later with nothing resolved. She doesn't call again after that. 2 weeks go by and I'm starting to settle into a routine when Gina shows up at my office. I'm walking out to my car after work, and there she is, leaning against her vehicle in the parking lot. She's not crying or yelling. She just stands there waiting for me. When I get close, she asks if we can talk like adults about what happened. Part of me wants to say no and just drive away, but I know I'll have to face her eventually. Better to do it now in public where she can't make a scene. I agree to get coffee at a shop down the street. We drive separately and meet inside. The place is busy with the after-work crowd, which makes me feel better. She orders something complicated with extra foam. I get black coffee. We sit at a small table by the window, and she starts talking immediately. She says she understands I was upset about the funeral. She gets that now. But leaving her when her dad was in the hospital was completely different and proves I never really loved her. I ask her to explain how it's different. She starts to answer, then stops. Starts again. Says her dad could have died. I point out that my mom did die. She says that's not the same because my mom was already gone by the time of the funeral. I feel something cold settle in my chest. I ask her to listen to what she just said. She doesn't seem to understand why that's wrong. I explain it slowly. Her dad was sick but recovering. My mom was dead and I was burying her. She chose to stay home with a dog that was fine. I chose not to go with her because she'd shown me exactly how much support I could expect from her. She shakes her head and says it's not the same thing at all. I tell her the divorce is happening whether she accepts it or not. Her face changes. She tries a different approach. She suggests marriage counseling. We can work through this, she says, if we just communicate better. I almost laugh but manage to keep my face neutral. I point out that I spent 3 months sleeping in the guest room and she never once asked if I was okay. Never asked if I wanted to talk about my mom. Never offered to look through photos or share memories. That's not a communication problem. That's a fundamental lack of caring. She starts crying and says I'm rewriting history. She gave me space because I said I needed it. I tell her we both know she was relieved to have me out of her way. She starts to argue, but I'm done. I pull out my wallet, leave cash on the table for my coffee, and walk out while she's still talking. I can hear her calling my name as I push through the door, but I don't turn around. The next month is exhausting. Gina refuses to sign the initial paperwork Leanna sends over. She changes the locks on the house even though legally I'm still entitled to access it. Leanna says we can compel her through the court, but it will take time. Meanwhile, Gina posts things on social media. Nothing direct, just vague statements about betrayal and abandonment and people who leave when things get hard. Her friends comment with heart emojis and supportive messages about how she deserves better. I don't respond to any of it. I block her on everything and try to move on with my life. But it's hard when she keeps finding ways to make things difficult. She calls my office and leaves messages with my assistant. She drives by my new apartment and parks outside for hours. Leanna assures me this is normal divorce behavior. People panic when they realize they're actually losing something. Gina will either calm down or will handle it through legal channels. Either way, the divorce will happen. It's just a matter of how much hassle she wants to create along the way. Frederick calls in November and invites me to Thanksgiving dinner at his house. I almost say no. The thought of sitting through a holiday without my mother makes my chest tight. But sitting alone in my apartment sounds worse. I agree to come. The day arrives and I drive to his house feeling strange. His whole family is there when I walk in. Aunts and uncles and cousins I haven't seen since the funeral. Everyone hugs me and asks how I'm doing. Nobody mentions Gina directly, but I can tell they all know what happened. We sit down for dinner, and Frederick's wife makes a toast about being grateful for family who shows up when it matters. Several people glance at me when she says it. Later, my aunt pulls me aside and says she's proud of me for leaving. She says watching me defend Gina at the funeral made her angry, but now she's glad I finally stood up for myself. By the end of the night, I realize my whole family has collectively decided I'm better off without her. It feels good to have that support, even if it comes with the sadness of knowing my marriage was apparently terrible to everyone except me. Early December arrives and Gina finally agrees to mediation. Leanna says Gina's own lawyer probably told her that refusing to cooperate was just costing her money in legal fees. We schedule a session for mid-December. I show up at the mediator's office downtown and find Gina already there with her lawyer. The mediator is a woman in her 50s who speaks in a calm, measured voice. She explains how this works. We'll discuss assets and debts and try to reach an agreement on how to divide everything. If we can't agree, we'll go to court and let a judge decide. Gina immediately starts talking about how she deserves more than half of everything. She says she sacrificed her career to support mine. I stare at her. She's worked full-time at the same marketing job for 6 years. She's never sacrificed anything. The mediator asks her to provide documentation of these sacrifices. Gina can't. She just keeps insisting she gave up opportunities to support me, though she can't name any specific opportunities. Her lawyer looks uncomfortable. The mediator suggests we each prepare documentation of our contributions to the marriage and come back after the holidays. We schedule another session for January. Walking out, I feel tired and frustrated, but at least the process is finally moving forward. Christmas arrived, and I found myself alone in my apartment surrounded by half-unpacked boxes I still hadn't dealt with. I pulled one open to look for my winter coat and found my mother's recipe cards instead. She'd given them to me years ago when I first moved out, saying I'd need to know how to make a proper Sunday roast. I'd forgotten they were even in there. I sat on the floor and went through them one by one. Her handwriting covered each card in blue ink, instructions written in her careful cursive with little notes in the margins. Don't skip the rosemary on the roast beef card. Your father likes extra garlic on the mashed potatoes. Best with vanilla ice cream on the apple pie recipe. I could hear her voice saying these things, could picture her standing in her kitchen pointing at ingredients and explaining timing. The grief hit me harder than it had since the funeral itself. I cried sitting there on my apartment floor holding recipe cards, remembering Sunday dinners at her house when I was growing up. The smell of roasting meat filling the whole place. Her laughing when I'd sneak taste before dinner was ready. My dad reading the paper at the table while she cooked. All of it was gone now. My mother was dead. My marriage was ending. I was processing both losses at the same time, and some days I couldn't figure out which one hurt more. The recipe cards went into a drawer in my kitchen where I could see them, but didn't have to think about them constantly. January brought the second mediation session. I drove to the same office downtown and found Gina already waiting with her lawyer. She looked tired, not crying or angry like last time, just worn down by the whole process. The mediator went through the same opening statements about reaching a fair agreement. This time, Gina didn't immediately launch into demands about deserving more than half. Her lawyer had probably explained that her claims about sacrificing her career wouldn't hold up since she'd worked the same job for 6 years. We went through the asset list item by item. She wanted to keep the house. I didn't want it anyway. Too many bad memories attached to that place now. She kept the house and her car. I kept my car and my retirement accounts. We split the savings account down the middle. It took 3 hours, but we actually agreed on everything. Leanna walked out with me after and warned me not to celebrate yet. She said Gina could still change her mind before we finalized the paperwork, that people often had second thoughts once agreements became real. But I felt hopeful for the first time in weeks that maybe we could get through this without everything becoming a huge legal battle. Late January, I stopped at the grocery store after work to pick up basics for the week. I was standing in the produce section trying to remember if I needed onions when someone tapped my shoulder. I turned around and found myself face to face with one of Gina's friends from her yoga class. She crossed her arms and looked at me like I'd done something terrible. She started talking about how I'd abandoned Gina when her father was sick, how cruel it was to refuse to support her during a family crisis, how she couldn't believe I'd just left like that. I was tired of defending myself, tired of explaining, tired of people who only knew Gina's version of events. I asked her one simple question. Would she have skipped her mother-in-law's funeral for a dog with an upset stomach? I watched her face change as she processed what I'd said. The anger drained out of her expression and got replaced with something else. Confusion, maybe. Or the realization that she'd only heard one side of the story. She mumbled an apology and hurried away down the aisle. I stood there holding a bag of apples and felt angry, but not surprised. Of course, Gina had been carefully editing the story to make herself look better. Of course, she'd told everyone I abandoned her without mentioning why. Of course, she'd painted herself as the victim. That's what she'd always done. Frederick started checking in with me regularly after that. We met for dinner once a week at this Italian place near his house. He'd ask about work and the divorce process and how I was holding up generally. One week in February, he asked if I was thinking about dating yet. I almost laughed. I told him honestly I could barely handle my own company right now, much less inflict my emotional mess on someone else. He laughed too and said that was probably the healthiest approach. He said I needed time to figure out who I was outside of a marriage that clearly wasn't working. That rushing into something new would just be avoiding dealing with everything that happened. His acceptance of my situation without any pressure to move on or get back out there was exactly what I needed. Everyone else seemed to think 6 months was enough time to be over a divorce and ready to start fresh. Frederick understood that healing doesn't work on a schedule. The divorce finalized in early March. 6 months exactly after my mother's funeral. Leanna called me at work to tell me the judge had signed everything and it was official. I thought I'd feel triumphant, vindicated somehow. Instead, I just felt tired and a little lost. The relief was there, but it got complicated by this wave of sadness I wasn't expecting. My marriage was actually over. That chapter of my life was completely closed. Leanna congratulated me when I went to her office to pick up the final papers. She said I'd handled everything with remarkable grace considering the circumstances. I thanked her and wondered if grace was just another word for being too emotionally exhausted to fight anymore. I drove to the cemetery for the first time since the funeral, found my mother's grave with the headstone we'd picked out. I stood there for a while, not really knowing what to say. Eventually, I told her about the divorce, apologized for not seeing sooner what she'd apparently seen all along about Gina. I like to think she'd be proud of me for finally standing up for myself, even though it cost me a marriage and the life I'd built over several years. The cemetery was quiet and peaceful. Just me and the graves and the sound of wind through the trees. I left feeling like I'd closed one chapter even though I had no idea what the next one looked like. April came and I was still struggling with the grief. Missing my mother. Feeling angry about the years I'd wasted with Gina. A coworker mentioned a grief support group that met at the community center on Tuesday nights. I almost didn't go. The idea of sitting in a circle talking about feelings with strangers sounded awful. But I went anyway because sitting alone in my apartment every night was worse. The group leader was a woman in her 60s who'd lost her husband to cancer. She said it was common to grieve multiple losses at the same time and that there was no timeline for healing. Some days I felt fine. Other days I could barely get out of bed. Hearing other people's stories helped me feel less alone in my mess. A guy my age had lost his father and gotten divorced the same year. A woman in her 40s was dealing with her mother's death while her marriage fell apart. We were all stumbling through the same kind of complicated grief. Frederick helped me move into a better apartment in May. A one-bedroom place with actual character instead of the generic temporary rental I'd been living in. Wood floors and big windows and a kitchen that didn't feel depressing. We spent the day hauling boxes up the stairs. Frederick brought old photo albums I'd never seen before. Pictures of my mother when she was young, before I was born. Her at 20 in a sundress laughing at something off camera. Her and my dad on their wedding day looking impossibly young. Her holding me as a baby with this expression of total love on her face. Frederick told me stories about her I'd never heard. How she'd wanted to be a teacher but ended up working at the bank instead. How she'd met my dad at a church picnic and knew immediately he was the one. How much she'd loved being a mother even though it wasn't always easy. I realized how much family history I'd almost lost by not paying attention while she was alive. We ordered pizza and spent the evening looking through albums. It felt like the first time in months that I was building something instead of just surviving. June arrived and I'd established a new routine that actually felt sustainable. I worked my regular hours, hit the gym 3 times a week, had dinner with Frederick every Tuesday, went to my support group on Thursdays. Slowly, I was becoming someone who existed independently rather than as half of a couple. The hard days still came. Days when I missed my mother so much it physically hurt. Days when I felt angry about all the years I'd wasted with Gina. But those days were becoming less frequent and less intense. I was learning to live with the grief instead of being crushed by it. July brought what would have been my mother's birthday. I took the day off work and volunteered at a local cancer support center in her memory. They had me organizing donated items and talking with families going through treatment. One woman thanked me for understanding what it was like to lose someone to cancer. She said most people didn't get it unless they'd been through it themselves. I realized that my mother's death and everything that followed had taught me something about showing up for people when it matters. I wasn't grateful for the pain, but I was grateful for the clarity it gave me about what kind of person I wanted to be. The kind who shows up. The kind who puts people before pets and obligations before convenience. The kind my mother had raised me to be before I'd lost sight of it somewhere along the way. August marked 6 months since the papers were finalized. I woke up that morning in my apartment and made coffee and went to work and came home and made dinner. Nothing special happened. Nothing terrible happened either. I was just existing in a way that felt normal for the first time since my mother died. Some mornings I still woke up and forgot she was gone. Some nights I still felt angry about the years I spent with someone who couldn't show up when it mattered. But those moments came less often now. I went to my support group on Thursday and talked about how weird it felt to be okay. Not happy exactly. Not sad either. Just okay. The group leader said that was progress. That grief doesn't follow a schedule and healing isn't linear. I visited my mother's grave on Saturday and told her about my life, the new job I'd started, the friends I'd been making, how Frederick and I had dinner every week and he told me stories about her. I thought about her last words at the hospital, how she said she was proud of the man I'd become. I hoped she'd be proud now, too. That standing up for myself counted as growth. That refusing to be treated as less important than a dog was the kind of thing she'd raised me to do. Life wasn't perfect. I was still figuring things out. But at least now I was doing it surrounded by people who actually showed up when it mattered.